one of the things I have read that it has been particularly inhospitable, at least in terms of like where the policy discussions are happening, to folks representing organizations outside of maybe sort of the wealthier nations. Tell us about that dynamic.
Well, I mean, it's been awful. It's been months of requirements and obstacles, and it's just been very hard to understand. For example, there was this promise of vaccines for most of the global south that delegates are needed to get there, to come here. Many did not get it, but it's still like the process of actually getting to know how will you get the vaccines was extremely uncertain for many months and weeks, and the time got closer. And just like a few weeks before they started giving them out, then there was this sort of coded country list that the UK had invented, and basically the whole global south was red, all Latin America was red, and that implied you had to do a quarantine, which you would have to pay, and then you have to struggle to see if the UK would have pay it for you, and then suddenly. When you already figured out you were going to do 7 nights of quarantine plus the 16 days of being at COP and all the costs that would have, and they just took it away. And also they took away 54 countries from the red list suddenly. And then 2 weeks after that, they took away all the countries from the red list that were also the 8 that were left were Latin American. And then that caused many people, for example, that counted the 7 nights that they had to do quarantine, to have no housing, no hotels, and either have to pay extra for their flights or find some way to stay somewhere before COP. So that's sort of the starting of it. And then we come here, and I mean, they say they have like COVID measures, but then everybody's packed like for the first 2 days for the high level event with all the presidents. All the observers were packed in the side events. There was nowhere to sit. More than 2/3 of the venue was closed to observers. Only party delegates could get through. So it's been just like a COVID nightmare, and there's like lines of people just filing to get in every morning. So it has not been easy, and it has caused many people, especially from the global south, not to be able to participate or to come here at least for the first 3 days and just sit on the floor because there's nothing else you can see on the platform to do, like to watch the streaming of the negotiations doesn't work and stuff like that. So it's been quite the trip. It's been quite a British experience. I don't recommend it.
And we should just remind people. I mean, this is the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference. I'm not sure why they call it COP as opposed to CCC, but why do they call it COP?
Well, it's called a Conference of Parties, so it depends like which country is part of which agreement. So that's basically what it changed.
All right, and so like ostensibly in the past, what has come out of this summit or this conference?
So in the past COP, the issue that remains that is sort of at the heart of these negotiations is you will hear everyone talking about Article 6, which has to do with the sort of the engine of the Paris Agreement in terms of how to do the mitigation, either with market mechanisms or non-market mechanisms, defining the rules to avoid double counting, which is basically cheating, and have like an actual process that countries implement nationally and it sort of get us to the target emissions, target temperature that we want, 1.5 or less than 2 degrees. And that's basically what is being agreed upon. It's sort of in the COP25 in Madrid 2 years ago that did not work. So that's probably at heart. There's also a whole bunch of other discussions, but I mean, for the Paris Agreement sort of to start being implemented and working, this has to be hammer out in this COP.
So, okay. So from the perspective, when I think, I obviously am not in a position to speak for all Americans, but I think at least my sense is when climate change is discussed and addressed within the context of this country and the way that we address it, it is really about how are we going to begin to diminish our output of CO2. In the context of someone coming from somewhere in the global south, and particularly in a country that is not the emissions that are coming from Costa Rica are seem to, I would imagine, would be pretty low on the list of things that we've got to get a control under. The issue set that is presented by climate change right now in 2021, it seems to me, is different than the one that is presented to us in the United States, which is, how do we mitigate our emissions, or how do we diminish our emissions, as opposed to, let's say, how do we deal with the implications of climate change as it exists now and going forward, in terms of like what it would do to a country like us? Will you talk about that, and what La Ruta de Clima, like what is your agenda when you go to a COP26, or just broadly speaking?
Sure. I mean, there's a huge difference. For example, in the case of the United States, it's more about sort of reaching a peak of emissions and then finding a way to remove and fix carbon, either through nature-based solutions, and now some people talk about like industrial means to remove carbon and make a business out of that also. But right now we haven't reached that peak. So every year, every COP, the emissions keep going. So the temperature of the planet keeps increasing. So that for the global south, and for people like me from Central America, that implies that each year the adverse effects of climate change are exponentially worse. And for regions like Central America, that is positioned in a place that the climate impacts hit hard, and it's also in a social economic situation that is already pre-existingly vulnerable. It implies that we have no control on how much the emissions or the causes of the emissions are being happening, and we have no way to stop climate change, and we have no means also to deal with the effects of it. So we're very dependent on whatever the US does, not only in providing the means for us to deal with the damage, and also sort of get some reparations to vulnerable communities that are the most affected. And as you mentioned, for example, my country doesn't even make 1% or 0.5% of the global emissions. And historically, the US and Europe and China and so on are not only the main responsibles, but are the ones that can actually reach a peak emissions, and then also have the resources to decrease those emissions, to fix them back into the soil, into whatever means of carbon removal that they decide to apply. So from our perspective, it's very tense, because we're not in control of the causes of climate change, but we bear the burden of the effects of it, and we do not have the resources to deal with it. And it implies lives lost, infrastructure loss, just a whole pack of human rights being violated. And that is something that is completely stressful, because and I think when you see it from like a corporate sort of position, everybody just say, oh no, just recycle, or try to be more sustainable. But at the end, we're talking about humongous amounts of emissions that are not being done in my country. So it doesn't matter how green Costa Rica is at the end, if the US and Europe and China and Russia do not decide to actually stop the increase of releases of carbon that we're doing right now in the type of economic system that we have.